Okay, today we're doing a cast for those who were not present in today's meeting and also going over the chapter. We'll be hitting the highlights. This will support you in your learning, so if you're having a problem with the assignment, you should refer to this video. You should watch it anyhow. I'm hoping to keep it under 15 minutes. We have a picture here looking at a street scene of a British city. Okay, this is a city in England, and some of the questions you should ask yourself are: what kind of a neighborhood is this? What kind of jobs do the people who live in this neighborhood doing? I'm going to show you some questions. So what kind of jobs might the people who live here have? And does everyone have a job? And the question is it like a clean job or a dirty job? And what's the difference? Remember, we looked at the picture of the family in the living room. It was this picture, and this depicts a middle-class family. This is not an aristocratic family. This is a family who works. This man has a job. He works. She probably stays at home and runs the household affairs and does community events. This is their home. Do you think that the home of the first picture that we showed you, the first picture is here, do you think these people's house looks like that? And what is the difference? Okay. So you also have some easier objectives that you want to understand how political forms basically affected suffrage or voting rights and Parliament, how Queen Victoria was very important, her influence and her values. What were some of the social and economic reforms that changed this picture right here? They see this picture and they say, this isn't right, we got to fix this. Describe the efforts by British women to win the vote and the struggle for Irish Home Rule and the impact that a famine had on Ireland. Here are your vocabulary terms, and you're going to use your textbook to give me the definition. That's a submission assignment. It's due today at 5 o'clock. All right, so we're going to now real fast go over the section. I'm going to have to adjust my screen size. So give me a second there for that, and let's go to next. And basically, you had two nations in Britain. This was said by the Prime Minister, who is he's the chief officer of the British Parliament. And what happens in Britain is the Queen is a constitutional monarch. She's limited severely. She does not make a lot of policy. She serves as a figurehead, but she is important. And by tradition, the Prime Minister forms a government in the name of the Queen. So it changes, but so the Queen, or in England now it's a Queen, the monarch, the Queen or the King, is the head of state, and the government is formed by her Prime Minister. All right. So, and Disraeli is one of the Prime Minister, and he really talked about the horrible state of life for working people in England. And he says basically, what we have are two nations, the rich and the poor. And have things changed that much? Are things better than they were? I think they've been changed. They certainly changed in Britain. There's still poor people. There are people who are going to be left out, and a society always has to ask itself, what are we doing to try to help people, lift them up so they can enjoy the benefits of the nation that they live in. And this is a picture of Parliament. The Parliament was not very democratic there. It did have voting, but voting sometimes was skewed. And you had two houses, and you still have them, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The House of Lords was for the aristocracy. It was the wealthy people, the wealthy landowners, and people who had noble blood. And the House of Commons was for everybody else, the bourgeoisie all the way down to the poor. The Commons represented about 90% of the country. The House about 10 or less, 10%. And yet they had equal power. This changes in the 19th century, that the House of Lords power, it starts like this. They're kind of even with the House of Lords having a little, I'm going to fix my hand. House of Lords is the higher one. Well, what happens is it changes. And by the end, the House of Commons has this much power and the House of Lords has much less, because the House of Commons represents 90% of the population. So you're going to be reading this. I'm not going to go over everything. There's a lot of pressure and here's a vocabulary term, rotten boroughs. Things really start changing. The revolution is happening in France, okay? France goes through revolution, riot after riot, violence after violence. England doesn't have that way. the battle in England is a political battle, but it's not a street battle. It's not involving people being killed. And you have two parties, and they're basically trying to make policies. The Whigs represent the middle class and business interests. The Tories speak for those whose interests, not just for the nobles, but those people who own land, like small farmers. So you have the landowning class and the nobility represented more by the Tory party, and the Whig party represents basically the middle class and business interests. The poor are kind of left out of the picture. One of the reasons was because Britain, you had to own property in order to vote. So only people who had land had a right to vote in England at this time. Well, that's changed. And what happens is, one of the first things is the Reform Act changes the way voting occurs. More people get to have voting. The Chartist movement is very important because it starts having a secret ballot. And this is important because people can be intimidated if their vote is not secret. So the secret ballot comes about also. And so you can see changes happening rapidly, and it's not happening in other countries. England doesn't have universal suffrage. And you might say, well, that's horrible. And by today's standards, yes, it is. But they were moving forward, giving more and more people suffrage, and more using the principles of the Enlightenment of the idea of popular sovereignty. Queen Victoria is one of the greatest monarchs in history. Now, she did not have a lot of governmental power, but she had influence because she set the tone. She was the head of state. She was a figurehead, and she was consistent, and she served her country well. She became a symbol of England and the British Empire, much like today Queen Elizabeth, who's been on the throne since, I believe, 1950 or so, about 70 years. Well, Queen Elizabeth was on the throne from 1837 to 1901. So she reigned. She became queen at like 18 years old, and she faced a lot of opposition, but she was smart. And there's just so many wonderful movies and shows about Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria had certain ideals, and she embodies, it's called the Victorian era. These values were hard work, duty to country and family, honesty, being thrifty, not being, she lived a very simple life as much as she could. Yes, she was a queen, but she was active. She was engaged. She was involved in heading up a lot of works to improve people's lives, and she put a lot of time into her day. So these were the values. And then being respectable. Respect, present yourself in a way that people will respect you and be respectful of other people. She had a number of children. I think she had 8, 9 children. She ended up having 36 grandchildren, and many of these people were in the monarchy of various countries. They were related. So you have grandchildren of Queen Victoria and her husband, Prince Albert, on thrones in Germany, in Italy, in Greece, in Russia, and this becomes very interesting as foreign policy works out later in the latter 19th and then the 20th century. Queen Victoria basically said that the lower classes, people who work, deserve what they earn, and they cannot be kept back. That means that they didn't have as many rights, and she was pushing for more universal suffrage, at least for the poor people who didn't have rights to vote. And that's the thing. Who are the people who need change? Are those who are not doing well? We talked about the importance of the secret ballot. This is an example of that. One of the reforms was that you would have privacy when you voted, and that police would monitor the voting. And this is important to ensure a fair election. And there's a lot of talk many times about fair and unfair elections. Why do you think that you have private voting booths? Why do you think a policeman is there? Why is it important? This is at a polling station in England. And again, you should be doing these activities on your own, or at least thinking about them. Just launch the activity. I'm not making you grade, but it will help you with your assignments and certainly with your semester exam. So you can look at basically the change of what happened. This is all the steps that happened that brought popular sovereignty more and more and more to England, and some of the social changes that also happened. And sovereignty is a big social change. I'm going to have to start again. So we're back, and we're looking here. These, again, we're talking more about some of the change. We're talking about the increase of democracy. William Gladstone was a leader of the Whig and it became the Liberal Party. And Gladstone and Disraeli was conservative, but both were concerned very much with social justice and especially with poverty. So these two are political rivals, but they had policies. They had the same goal, but they used different approaches. So one of the things they pushed through increasing suffrage, expanding it to people, to working class men, people who didn't own property, and this doubles the size of people who voted for him. And one of the things is that many people who were of the Conservative Party, this got people in the working class who had to work day to day start saying, "Hey, we like the Conservatives." Gladstone also extends the suffrage, and he appeals to farm workers who had been the people who were the Tories or the Conservatives, people who own land, and it gives the vote to farm people. So they're each expanding, the goal is expanding democracy, and they're each reaching to different constituents. So they have different approaches to expanding democracy, but the same goal. This becomes a victory for democracy because you have more of a parliamentary democracy. Britain has changed from being a constitutional monarchy where the queen or the ruling monarch has a lot of power to a parliamentary democracy where the queen's role, she still is the head of state. She still has a lot of influence, but a lot of it is symbolic of the nation. Queen Elizabeth is a symbol of England to most of the people who live there, and many people really, really love her, and they just are proud of her. They can see as someone that they love and identify with. Recently, I was watching a movie, and it's based on true events about when Princess Diana died, and how the British people were upset that Queen Elizabeth was being quiet on it, and that was because of Queen Elizabeth's personal feelings about family and privacy. And what Queen Elizabeth realized is she had to change because her people needed to see her. And once she did that, it changed the attitude, and she became one of the most popular people in England to this day. When you have more people voting, things are going to change. They're going to reform. One of the issues is free trade. It's still an issue today. Free trade versus fair trade. And that means what goods go into your country from foreign countries? What kind of restrictions do you put on the marketplace? And you can look at that. Corn laws were very important. They were very controversial. They are in place. They proved to not be as effective as wanted, and then they're repealed, which helps a large part of people. Corn was a major source of nutrition for people. You have to realize that in this day and age, that most people didn't have meat every day. They had meat rarely because the meat packing industry was just evolving and changing. And by the end of the 19th century, meat in Great Britain and in the United States becomes a staple of the diet. Before that, it was grains. It was bread made or recipes made from wheat, oats, and corn. Those were the staples, and you had root vegetables. Those are your basic staples of the diet in both the United Kingdom and in Great Britain, I should say, and in the United States. It starts changing, and by the latter part or the mid to the latter part of the 19th century, meat becomes a part of every person's food idea. Slavery is abolished in England. A lot of it is because of the Enlightenment ideas, but a lot of it, honestly, is because it's not profitable. Although England never really adopted slavery, the United States does have slavery, and it's a major issue and and a large part of the growing dissatisfaction and disaffection between the slave-owning states and the free states. A large part of slavery was economic in the United States. The morality issue was one conflicting argument. So it was basically we need a cheap, almost free labor force versus the morality based upon Enlightenment ideas and human rights. And it was not easily solved. One thing that was very interesting was that capital punishment was used a great deal. It started to change. Criminal justice system is changed in England. And we see that as England changes, a lot of times it would later be reflected in the United States. This is a great activity that shows how the working people who had to do these dirty jobs, these hard jobs, the people who worked the hardest often got the less benefit from a free society. So this basically talks about how did labor change and how politically how it changed and what the effects were. It made life better for people who had to go to work every day and work hard. So that is basically the end. The last part is women's suffrage, and this is something that would happen.